Thanks be to God.
May you live in interesting times. That phrase has caused me to reflect on the interesting times I have lived through. Born on the eve of the Korean War, moving to Germany with my family in 1956 in the fall, as Soviet tanks were moving to crush Hungary, and my father disappeared as soon as we got settled in Frankfurt. He had gone to the Austrian frontier to help Hungarian refugees. It was a scary time for my mother, and I was just beginning to understand what was at stake. I've lived through 18 or 19 U.S. involved wars in the meantime, and one is still going on. 9/11 bombing. 40 years we had a very similar situation. Protesters in the streets protesting for civil rights, and then against the Vietnam War and police brutality, senseless violence. It was a raid against peaceful protesters, taking many lives. I lived through the Kennedy assassination, and Martin Luther King assassination was assassinated on my 18th birthday. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated a week after my high school graduations, and I've seen 3 presidents impeached. Interesting times. Interesting times indeed that we are now living in. Uncertain times, fearful times. We live in the time of pandemic. Pandemic, of course, you know, is a word to describe the plague. It's not as scary as plague, which it is, but it doesn't conjure up the same images of massive infections and death. Its origins are unknown, the cures and vaccines nowhere in sight, infecting millions across the globe and killing hundreds of thousands. Again, marchers in the streets for civil rights. Again, brutality and violence arrayed against them. In case all that is not sufficient, bubonic plague has been found in squirrels. In the western part of our city. How shall we live in a time of plague? Martin Rinkert was born April 23 in 1586 in Eilenburg, Saxony, Germany, the son of a struggling coppersmith. He attended the local Latin school and then received a scholarship to the famous St. Thomas School in Leipzig, the one that Bach would later be the music director at. His scholarship was as a chorister because of his musical gifts. It later allowed him to enroll in the theological faculty at the University of Leipzig, after which he was ordained. You might say he showed up at just the wrong time, for it was just coming back to his hometown at the age of 31 to serve as leader of his home congregation. Having been turned down for the job 7 years earlier because the superintendent had thought him a better musician than a theologian. He had written 60 hymns and 7 religious plays. The same year he was appointed there, a devastating war broke out in the region, one that not only lasted 30 years, but claimed more than 8 million casualties, or 20% of the German population at the time. It was differences between Catholic and Protestants that started the whole thing, still sorting out the after effects of the Reformation almost 100 years after it took place. But like so many other conflicts, it soon morphed into something far greater, with the religious differences soon disappearing, becoming lost in the greater geopolitics of the time, eventually arraying 12 or 13 nations against one another. Still, the young pastor faithfully did his work as best he could. Even while the armies of the great nation all around his province of Saxony ravaged the land, leaving farms and shops depleted and destroyed. What's more, the pastor found himself not only forced to deal with the soldiers that had been forcefully quartered in his house, quickly diminishing his own supplies, but with the hordes of refugees who poured into his walled city for protection until Eilenberg became overflowing with human need. And if that were not enough, a disaster so severe that even the invasion of the Swedes paled beside it. For the combination of overcrowding, ruined crops, and crippled infrastructure produced a famine so extreme that it was said 30 or 40 people could be seen in the streets fighting to claim not toilet paper, but a dead cat or a crow to eat. And then the bubonic plague struck. In 1637, it quickly spread throughout the town, claiming more than 8,000 lives in a single year there. To make matters worse, however, the church superintendent went away for a change of scenery and never came back, and the remaining 5 clergy in the town, 4 of them quickly died of the plague, leaving only the young archdeacon to carry on. He often had funeral services for 40 or 50 people in a day, until finally the dead had to be piled in unmarked trenches. In fact, he buried 4,480 individuals in that day, including his first wife. Still, Martin Rinkart labored on with an almost inexplicable trust in God and a readiness to give thanks. For even though worn out and prematurely aged by the time that a long looked-for peace ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, some 14 months before his own death, the poet, musician, and playwright turned preacher left behind an incredible testimony of his faith in a hymn we have all too often rendered to the times of abundance and well-being, relegated only to the Thanksgiving season. Written just as the plague began to hit his hometown in 1636. It was first a prayer for his family, but soon a hymn, Nun danket alle Gott, became the theme of Martin Rinkart's life. Now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things has done, in whom this world rejoices, who from our mother's arms hath blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. Oh, may this bounteous God through all our life be near us, with ever joyful hearts and blessed peace to cheer us, and keep us in his grace, and guide us when perplexed, and free us from all ills in this world and the next. All praise and thanks to God the Father now be given, the Son, and him who reigns with them in highest heaven, the one eternal God, whom earth and heaven adore. For thus it was, 'tis now, and shall be evermore. It reminds me of a sermon not too long ago when Pastor Alice took us on a tour of the prophet Habakkuk. The prophet Habakkuk was an artist as well, a poet, a songwriter. He painted word pictures to describe the excruciating circumstances in which he lived. And then he painted a word picture of the God, the all-powerful God in whom he put his trust and on whom he relied and now called for help. To sum it all up, the last paragraph of this symphonic poem reads like this: though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and makes me tread upon the heights. And then as a postscript, even as Martin Rinker might have put it, to the leader, with stringed instruments. Two men separated by thousands of years, but sharing the same faith, going through similar excruciating times, are examples to us of what it means to live in the time of plague.